What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands. I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. Joining me today, Chris Fedor, Cavs beat reporter for cleveland.com. And Chris, we have our first sign of life for the 2025-2026 season. And you know what that means, Chris? Power rankings. This time, courtesy of The Athletic. The New York Times recently signed, and Law Murray is the first person that we get to discuss with going into his power rankings for the 2025-2026 season. He wrote it for July 23rd. He has different categories: top contenders, in a good place, the bubble, not the tier to fear, and the basement floor. So let's get into it, starting with the top tier. Obviously, tier one, number one, he has listed the Oklahoma City Thunder, the team that won the championship last year. They're the defending champs coming into the 2025-2026 season, and they're only getting better, Chris. But number two on his list, the New York Knicks. Number three, none other than the Cleveland Cavaliers. Number four, the Minnesota Timberwolves. Number five, the Denver Nuggets. Number six is where he gets into tier two, in a good place. So let's start with the first five. What do you think about these rankings and where the Cavs fall, being third on this list?
I think it's about right, Ethan. I keep going back and forth on the Cavs and the Knicks. But the Knicks went to the conference finals, and even though they have a new coach in Mike Brown, who's replacing Tom Thibodeau, they also added two components to their bench, which I think are going to really help the Knicks. Like, part of what a lot of people wondered about New York was, do they have enough depth? Do they have a strong enough bench? Are they over-reliant on some of their top players, Cat, Jalen Brunson, Bridges, OG? For them to get Jordan Clarkson, you can say what you want to about him and how streaky he is, and does his game translate to winning? We're talking about somebody who's going to come off the bench and provide a nice boost, somebody who's going to provide a little bit of playmaking and scoring in the non-Jalen Brunson minutes. And then Yabu is a really good addition for them. And they could still get another piece, maybe even Ben Simmons, who would help them defensively. So I think I have some questions about the kind of offense that they're going to be under Mike Brown. That's never really been his forte. But I think they have enough talent offensively that the system may not make that much of a difference. And if you just talk about like what a team has accomplished versus another one, the Knicks and the Cavs are very, very close. But the Cavs not being able to get past the Eastern Conference semifinals, that gives me a little bit of pause, and I think they're ranked about where they should be, and it's appropriate. Do you think they should be above the Knicks? I don't. I keep going back and forth on that, but I don't think I can do that right now.
Chris, so me and Jimmy did a little game a few weeks ago when we listed out the biggest threats for the Cleveland Cavaliers for this coming season, and on my list was the New York Knicks. And I do think that they have the pedigree, the experience to challenge the Cleveland Cavaliers. I just think this version of the Cavs is much, much different than the team that they faced a few postseasons ago, where the Knicks just simply outclassed them. You're absolutely right. They're more so on an even playing field coming into this season. And I also think it's interesting when you talk about the Knicks, is because they have a lot of unrestricted free agents, but they haven't had any true departures yet this season. You mentioned the acquisition of Jordan Clarkson and Gershon Yabusele, but I think figuring out what they're going to do with Precious Achiuwa, Landry Shamet, Cameron Payne, PJ Tucker, DeLon Wright, those are all going to be interesting decisions made by the Knicks. And I also think you made a good point. I think the biggest thing, and one that Law Murray talked about, is what is new coach Mike Brown going to do in his first season? How is he going to use the roster, the lineup construction differently than what Tom Thibodeau did in the previous years when he got them to the Eastern Conference Finals, when he got them back-to-back 50 wins in the first time in a very long time. We talked about on our previous podcast the pressure being on the Cleveland Cavaliers. there's a lot of pressure on Mike Brown and the Knicks to be able to figure out what they're going to accomplish this season as well. Or they're kind of in the same boat as the Cavs, not necessarily being in the second apron, but we might have to reconstruct some things if it doesn't work this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the questions about Mike Brown as a coach, we have seen him be successful. And so this isn't a situation where, they're going from Tom Thibodeau to a first-time head coach that has never done it before, that has no experience whatsoever. And there is a layer of uncertainty going from Tibbs to Mike Brown, but it's not to the same level as what it could have been for New York. So I don't think there's going to be a drastic drop-off. And then, like I said, even though he's a defensive-minded coach, and he is, and that's what he is going to pride himself on, and he may put together lineups that reflect that. The Knicks had the 5th best offense in the NBA last year. That's not because of Tibbs. We can't sit here and pretend that that's because of Tibbs, because he's a defensive-minded coach too. Now, I give him credit for changing some of the things that he did offensively, but that was more about the components that they brought in there. That was about the Jimmies and the Joes, not the X's and O's. So even though Mike Brown's going to have a defense-first mentality, having Jalen Brunson, having Cat, having Mikal Bridges, having OG, and then having Clarkson come off the bench and Yabu coming off the bench, they're set up to be a high-level, high-ceiling offensive team despite some of Mike's shortcomings as an offensive mind. And who knows, maybe one of the hires that he makes throughout the course of this offseason is somebody who does have more of an offensive background. He does have more modern philosophies. And maybe Mike Brown learned some things, just like Kenny Atkinson did when he was in Golden State, being alongside Steve Kerr. Maybe Mike Brown learned some things being in Golden State alongside Steve Kerr that he can implement into the way that he does things with the Knicks. So I think given the roster enhancements that they've made, the fact that it's not a huge drop-off at head coach, and the fact that they have advanced, this group itself has advanced to the conference finals, I think they get a slight edge going into the season over the Cavs, even though the Cavs may have more high-end talent with Donovan Mitchell, with Evan Mobley. They have more continuity with Kenny Atkinson coming back in year 2 and a lot of the players that they have on the roster. And of course, the Cavs won 64 games in the regular season. If somebody were to say, all right, I'm going to release a power rankings and I'm going to put the Cavs in front of the Knicks, I don't think you could quibble with that. I think they're very, very close together. I think there's a reason why they're 2 and 3 on this list. And I think the thing that it kind of says to me, and this is kind of what I've been thinking as well, is that it feels like we have to see it from Orlando before we start talking more about them. It feels like to me the Knicks and the Cavs have kind of distanced themselves slightly from some of the other teams in the Eastern Conference. You know how last year we were having the conversation about, hey, Boston in the East, going into the season, Boston's on its own tier, and then everybody else is behind them. I think the Cavs and the Knicks are on their own tier in the Eastern Conference, and it's up to Orlando, it's up to Atlanta, it's up to Indiana to prove that they're not just going to completely crumble. It's up to the Atlanta Hawks to show that their offseason maneuvering is going to translate to on-court success. It's up to all those other teams to try and catch up to New York and Cleveland.
From my list for the Cavs' biggest threats coming into the season, I actually had the Knicks number 3 on my list behind Atlanta and Orlando, which you just referenced. And that's because of the style of play that Atlanta and the style of play that Orlando has, rather than what the Knicks pose, and obviously having the star power to match up with the Cleveland Cavaliers. Obviously, Karl Anthony Towns, when he gets going, can be a true force on both ends of the floor. Jalen Brunson, one of the most clutch players in the NBA to date. I just think that Atlanta, with returning Jalen Johnson, and Orlando getting Desmond Bane, kind of filling in the hole that they were missing, plus the defensive pressure that they're still going to be able to apply, are a little bit more threatening if the Cavs were to face them in a 7-game series as of right now. But we're not getting into that. We're going to get into the rest of this list. For his number 4 spot, Law Murray has the Minnesota Timberwolves, and for his fifth spot, as I mentioned, he has the Denver Nuggets. Two Western Conference teams, but I'm not surprised by these at all. Minnesota and Denver. I think Denver arguably had one of the best off seasons possible, going and getting Tim Hardaway Jr., Bruce Brown, Jonas Valanciunas, and Cam Johnson, while losing Dario Saric and Michael Porter Jr., plus having a couple of different players in free agency that they can go away from, that can clear some space up, and all these different things. Russell Westbrook, DeAndre Jordan. The Denver Nuggets are I don't even want to say sleeper team because they've been there before, but in this kind of year, in this kind of era, in this kind of league, because again, as we've talked about in the past, to beat the champs, you have to beat the champs. And in the Western Conference, you have to go through the defending champions to get there. Obviously, with Nikola Jokic, you're going to be in the contention, but now they're putting the right pieces around him to be able to have a different level of success that they haven't had since they went to the NBA Finals.
I think this is too low. I think the Nuggets are the second best team in the NBA, and I think people need to start viewing them that way. The team that they lost to in the playoffs last year, it was the Oklahoma City Thunder. It was the team that went on to win the NBA championship. And the Nuggets, despite a flawed roster and a lot of injuries that they were dealing with, took the Thunder to 7 games. And they still have Jokic, and the moves that they made this offseason, just really, really good given the situation that they're in. You know, some limitations in terms of their spending, some restrictions in terms of where they were. Cam Johnson is a big upgrade over Michael Porter Jr. He can just do more. We have the conversation all the time about Lonzo Ball, Isaac Okoro here in Cleveland, and the thing that we keep coming back to is that Lonzo can do more. He can help you in more ways. Cam Johnson can do more than Michael Porter Jr. He can help in more ways. He's more of a versatile scorer as opposed to just a three-point threat. He rebounds. He can get involved in the playmaking aspects of things. He's just a better player, and he can do more. He's defensively more reliable as well. Tim Hardaway Jr. is going to fit great there. He's going to give them more offensive potency. He's going to give them more three-point shooting. Bruce Brown, we've already seen how they can use him within the confines of that offense. They're not going to ask him to do a whole bunch more, but just, be a connector on the offensive end of the floor. Play multiple positions, guard multiple positions, fill a couple of different roles. We've already seen him do that for the Nuggets. And then Jonas Valanciunas, provided he stays in the NBA, and all indications are he's going to stay in the NBA. The one thing that the Nuggets had happen over and over and over is that they completely crumbled without Jokic. It's part of the reason why I always voted Jokic for MVP, is because they were one of the worst teams in the NBA in the minutes without Jokic because they just did not have somebody reliable enough. And if you talk about the difference between DeAndre Jordan and Jonas Valanciunas, it's significant. One guy may play in the NBA this year on a veteran's minimum deal who can really only rebound, block shots, and catch lobs at this point in time. And then there's Jonas Valanciunas, who is a backup quality, a reliable backup quality, sometimes starter center. Like, that's all you need for somebody like Jokic. Just don't completely get decimated in the non-Jokic minutes. That's all that Denver really needs. And I think Valanciunas will make them competent enough in the non-Jokic minutes. And then beyond that, they already have Christian Brown, who is in the conversation for most improved player. Jamal Murray, we've seen him perform at a high level in the playoffs. Aaron Gordon, we've seen him raise his level in the playoffs. So to me, there are less questions about the Nuggets than there are about the Knicks, the Cavs, the Magic, anybody else in the NBA besides the Thunder. So if you're going to put the Thunder number one, that's fine. Totally understand that. They're the reigning champions. I'd have them number one as well. But there's no way that I'd put New York or Cleveland above Denver. I think Denver is the second best team in the NBA coming into this year, both on body of work and what they've already proven, and based on the enhancements that they've made to their roster. They really plugged a lot of the holes that they had. And I think they plugged them with the right fitting players and the right types of players. So I think Denver's a little bit too low here. I think Denver is, if the Cavs were to get to the NBA Finals, if I'm a Cavs fan, I would want nothing to do with the Denver Nuggets. And I would want nothing to do, obviously, with the Thunder. But more than anybody else, Denver. I would want nothing to do with them.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody would have a different sentiment when you look at the roster. But as we're talking about this power rankings, as we're talking about this list, I was surprised to see the Minnesota Timberwolves still number 4 on this spot because they didn't really make any additions and they lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker, right?
Yeah.
So their depth shrunk a little bit. You obviously added Joan Baring J from the draft, but that doesn't necessarily help a competing contention team in his first year in the NBA, right? Sure, you re-signed Julius Randle. Sure, you re-signed Naz Reid and Joe Ingles, but that's not improvement, right? I think this list, this power ranking, might be banking a little bit too much on the development of Anthony Edwards into a super megastar. I don't know how much better you want him to get, right? Because he is already pound for pound one of the best players in the league. He's already competing to be a star in the Western Conference, and he's already helped them get to the Western Conference Finals. I think this is a kind of a situation with Denver where they had one of these premier stars, but they didn't have the pieces around him. I'm still skeptical about the Minnesota Timberwolves and them having less depth pieces around Anthony Edwards to be able to have success required, especially with the Denver Nuggets improving, especially with the Houston Rockets, who we're going to get to in a second, and other teams in the Western Conference seemingly getting better over the offseason. It didn't feel like the Minnesota Timberwolves made enough moves to be this high on this list, so I think they're too high. I'm not saying I would switch Denver and Minnesota, Chris, but I think Minnesota should be lower, and I think there's other teams in contention that I have had my eye on, especially when we're talking about the Western Conference.
I think Minnesota's very Cavsy from last year, Ethan. If you remember the Cavs going into last year, the thing that we talked about beyond the change in coaching staff and philosophy and how that was an unquantifiable variable. The thing that we said about the Cavs is continuity, right? They brought back 13 of 14 full-time NBA roster guys. And the other thing we talked about with the Cavs was internal improvement. All right, what's the leap that Evan Mobley can make? How much better can Darius Garland get? Can he bounce back from what he called one of the most difficult years of his entire life, not just his basketball career? So I think that's similar to Minnesota. How much better is McDaniels going to be? How much more comfortable is Julius going to be in year 2 with Minnesota? If you remember at the beginning of the season, Minnesota was talking about, we don't really like each other. These guys, we got some questions in the locker room about chemistry and fit and all that kind of stuff. Have they worked through all of those kinds of things? How much better is Terrence Shannon Jr. going to be? They've invested a first-round pick in him. He got some meaningful playoff minutes. There's some internal improvement that can happen with him. Dante DiVincenzo was not comfortable going from New York to Minnesota, but is he going to be more comfortable in year 2 if he's still on the roster? Rob Dillingham is a former lottery pick for the Timberwolves. So I think for them, it's chemistry, continuity, more togetherness, and internal improvements from some of the guys that are going to be thrust into a bigger role. But it was about the situation that they were in. There probably wasn't a lot that they could do apart from, going big and trying to get KD. So let's bank on the things that we have on our side that was similar to the direction, even though they didn't change their coach, that was similar to the direction that the Cavs went in last year. And we saw the results of that. And I'm not saying Terrence Shannon Jr. is going to be Evan Mobley. I'm not saying that, Rob Dillingham's going to have a breakthrough season where he becomes an all-star. But when you're an already good team, you can bank on some of these internal organic improvements. And it feels like that's in the situation that Minnesota is in, given their salary cap limitations, it seems like that's what the Timberwolves are banking on. And I don't hate that for them.
I wouldn't describe myself as a fan of it, but I can see where they're going with it. And obviously, as you mentioned, because we cover it, the Cleveland Cavaliers had a very similar situation last year. And I think that's a great comparison. I just think the situations were different. In the playoffs specifically, the Cavs had more injuries that they were dealing with than the Minnesota Timberwolves. And they continue to say that what if would have happened if they weren't dealing with those. So I think that's the only main difference. Okay, Chris, we're going to get into these next two sections because I think there are some teams that are arguably too low, arguably too high, and I want to get into them rather quickly, but I'm going to just go through them really quick. Tier 2, in a good place. Number 6, the Houston Rockets. Number 7, the LA Clippers. The 8th spot, Orlando Magic. And then number 9 gets into tier 3 with the bubble. Number 9 spot is Golden State Warriors. Number 10 is the Detroit Pistons. Number 11 is the LA Lakers. Number 12 is the Milwaukee Bucks. And number 13, the Atlanta Hawks. This is a bigger section.
I mean, there are so many questions about a lot of these Eastern Conference mainstays.
Yeah.
And that's the situation that the Cavs are in right now. And that's why we've talked about the expectations. We've talked about the pressure. Because the landscape in the East has changed drastically over the last 6 months. And it wasn't an off season where the Cavs made improvements to pull closer to some of these other teams that distanced themselves. It's that some of these teams that had distanced themselves went in reverse and got closer to Cavs. What do you do with Milwaukee? When you're trying to rank these teams and you're trying to assess the threat level that these teams pose to the Cavs in the East, what do you do with Milwaukee? You can't completely dismiss them, Ethan, because they have Giannis. He's the best player in the Eastern Conference. He's one of the best players in the NBA. He's either 2 or 3 in the NBA. So you can't just dismiss them. And they did bring in Miles Turner, and he is better than Brook Lopez. But, like, are they really a contender just because they have Giannis? They brought the band back together, but the band sucked. Like, the band was out of tune, and they were off key, and, like, some of these dudes that were supposed to be in a line were off center and stuff like that. So, okay, great. You brought back Kevin Porter Jr. Woo! You brought back Taurean Prince. You brought back Gary Trent Jr. And in the situation that they were in, they really couldn't make a bunch of external improvements. So their hands were beyond going out and getting Miles Turner. If that's going to be your big splash, you're going to be limited in the other things that you can do. Cole Anthony, Gary Harris. So I don't really know what to do with Milwaukee. I'm not a huge believer in them. But I'm also not saying that a Giannis-led team is going to be like a shoo-in for the play-in tournament. They're kind of between 4 and 6 in the East, I would say. But they get such like a boost of that tier because Giannis. And then you talk about Indiana. What do you do with them? You can't completely dismiss them. They've got a great coach. They've got a great culture. They still have really talented players, but one of the most impactful players in the entire NBA is going to be missing for this entire season. So what do you do with them? And then Atlanta, great. A lot of really good moves, smart moves this offseason. Really like that. But is it all going to come together the way that they think it's going to come together? So I just think beyond the Cavs and the Knicks, and I love Orlando. I think what Orlando did just identified what the weaknesses were, and they found somebody who is an ideal fit to help correct some of those weaknesses and help fix some of those limitations. But even Orlando, you have to see it. You have to see it before you truly buy into it. It wouldn't be a surprise to me if by mid-November, Orlando is top 5 in most people's power rankings. That would not be a surprise to me if it all comes together the way they think it will, because I think people will understand just how much of a great fit Desmond Bane is and how much he fixes so many of the offensive weaknesses that Orlando already had. But you'd be foolish to not have questions about it coming into the season. And then Boston, what the heck do you do with Boston? Jaylen Brown has won Finals MVP. He's still there. Anthony Simons might set a record for how many three-pointers he shoots in the Boston system if he's still on that roster. But, man, losing Drew, losing Porzingis, even losing Luke Cornett when you don't really know what you're doing at the center spot, I don't know. I don't know what to do with Boston either. And I think it just shows how up in the air everything is in the Eastern Conference, really beyond Cleveland and New York. Detroit, Malik Beasley was a big deal for them. He was an adult in the room. He was a stabilizing force coming off the bench. He was in the 6th man of the year conversation. They've changed some of the components on the bench, and they've tried to help the bench. And I think Karis LeVert does help that, but he's a different kind of player. And then Duncan Robinson is JB. How much is he going to play him if he's not going to guard anybody out there? So I like Detroit, and they're certainly a team on the rise. And what they did in the playoffs, maybe if they did have Jaden Ivey, they would have won that first round playoff series. I don't know. But I think there are questions about them too. Especially when they've been forced into some of these additions and some of these changes that they weren't necessarily expecting coming off their playoff run. So really, it's Cleveland, New York, and then there are teams that I could see becoming contenders and becoming threats by the end of the season or midway through the season. But coming into the year, I'm kind of in show me, prove it to me first.
Chris, I think you make great points. And I think for me, it's mostly looking at the rankings and figuring out who I don't have as much faith as I used to in anymore, right? And for me, that's the Golden State Warriors and the LA Lakers, right? I don't know if I believe in Steph Curry to carry a team that didn't make any acquisitions. Again, going back to the point that, like, you need players around you, especially as an aging player, to have success, right? For the Golden State Warriors to not make a single addition in this offseason and still be ranked 9th on this list is a little bit baffling to me. Then you have the LA Lakers. You have the fragility of the Lakers situation with Luka and LeBron, and yet they're still ranked 11th. And their starting center is DeAndre Ayton. I don't know how I feel about that. You went and get Marcus Smart. I think that's the best signing they made this offseason, right? You add Marcus Smart to help out your defense, one of the areas that you have struggled in the most, but you lose Dorian Finney-Smith, lose Jordan Goodwin, you lose Shake Milton because you waived those last 2 players. LeBron opted in. Jackson Hayes, you re-signed, even though you went and got a different center. I just think it's a wonky situation in LA right now, and I wrote about that for the site yesterday, just about the difference between the fragility of the passing of the torch between the Los Angeles Lakers and how the Cavs are operating and doing it in a more stable and fundamental way. The other portion that we mentioned, Milwaukee, I don't think they should be in the 12th seed or the 12th spot on this one, because to me, they also are the same team from last year with Miles Turner, but is Miles Turner going to be able to make a big impact? Also, Gary Harris, Cole Anthony, I don't think either of those guys have proven to be a starter quality point guard. So you have more ball handling than you did at the beginning of the offseason, but to what extent, to what length? And I think the Atlanta Hawks are too low. I think that's another team that had a great offseason, getting Nickeil Alexander-Walker, getting Kristaps Porzingis, getting Luke Kennard, understanding what Trae Young needed around him, what Trae Young needed to be successful, what Trae Young was looking for. Trae Young was a big portion of the acquisitions that the Atlanta Hawks made. And I think that helps their case because you're like, well, you're the star. If these are the players you think that can help you, we're going to go get them. And I think that's important to note just for the simple construction of what they're about to do. Plus, even though it's not an acquisition, you're getting Jalen Johnson back this season. So, and he was one of the best risers and up and comers of last year, arguably on an all-star pace. So I think him coming back, plus the acquisitions that they made, makes Atlanta a more difficult team to rank, even though they're 13th on this list. They were 18th before the offseason. I think they could even get bumped up even higher, like maybe 9, 10, or 11, right?
Yep.
But I just think Law Murray from The Athletic did a great job with this list. We're obviously going to react and argue about some of the different things that he did. But the reality of making these power rankings, you're not going to please everybody. 1. 2, I just think it's hard to, with all the injuries and with all the changes and the moves, to grade everybody on the same curve, because there are teams that in the Western Conference have more experience, but in the Eastern Conference have more hunger, have more drive. And I think that's the kind of situation that we're in when we're talking about the two different conferences and this power rankings in general. Is there a team, Chris, that you think outside of the Denver Nuggets that should be exponentially higher on this list than they are currently?
I don't think from the outset. Like I said, I think this is a situation, and this is kind of the offseason that we've had in the NBA, and this is going into 25, 26 with so much uncertainty and so many stars missing for such an extended stretch that I think it's by the time we get to November, December, some of these teams that are lower are really going to rise. And I think there are teams that are capable of making these big time leaps. You know, last year, how we were talking a little bit about, well, look out for the Detroit Pistons because they have the components to kind of rise up the standings in the Eastern Conference. And we talked about it for a variety of reasons. I think there are certainly teams out there that, if you want to call them sleeping giants, they exist. And it makes it really, really interesting. And the ones that stand out to me are the ones that we've talked about. I would not be surprised if Atlanta, by midway through the season, is a top 8 team or something like that in the power rankings, because I think they have the components to do that. And there's another variable to Atlanta that you didn't even mention. They have the they have the number 1 overall pick before Cooper Flagg arrived, probably coming off their bench in a 6-man role. And he had a pretty good rookie season. He certainly had a pretty good finish to his rookie season. So there's some internal improvements beyond the external stuff that was really smart for Atlanta that they brought in. Dyson Daniels can get better, right? There are reasons to believe that Dyson can get better. There are reasons to believe that Risache can get better. Maybe there's something there with Kobe Buffkin. Maybe. I don't know. But like, you have these young guys that you've invested in that now all of a sudden you don't have to rely on them as much. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to ask Risache to be a 30 to 35 minute a night starter on a team that wants to contend in the East. That's a different kind of role. That's a different kind of expectation. That's one that, from a basketball maturity standpoint, he's probably more ready for a 6-man of the year role or a 7th-man role. And they're able to do that because of the additions that they've made to their roster. So I think Atlanta would not be a surprise to me if they jumped into the top 8 of these power rankings once the season started. I'm a big believer in Orlando. I think they have an ability to be like one of the true championship contenders. So those are the two that really stand out to me. And the wild card, of course, is Philly. Never healthy, but man, is there talent on that roster. So they could completely go the other way. If things go the wrong way for Philly, it could be something similar to what we saw this year with the 76ers. but there's also the components there, and there's a high level of talent there to just be like, hey, this all comes together. We all stay. I don't think it's going to happen this way, but there is the possibility of it all coming together the right kind of way, getting a motivated, improved version of Joel Embiid and just saying like, hey, the talent finally came together. We're still here in the Eastern Conference. Don't forget about us.
Going back to my biggest threats rankings that I did with Jimmy, I had Philly at number 5 on my list because of if they're healthy. But obviously, Paul George underwent successful arthroscopic surgery on his left knee before the season even began. So we're still throwing our hands up and waiting to see when, if, can the Philadelphia 76ers stay or be healthy at full capacity, right? And obviously, there was a great article that came out on Joel Embiid and his progression and trying to get back to where he is and everything he's dealt with over the last couple of years, written by ESPN. But the reality is, this isn't a sob story, right? You kind of constructed this roster knowing that there was a potential for injury, knowing there was a potential for breakdowns. And you bet that people were going to do the work to stay healthy. It hasn't been that way. And just going back to final thoughts about the power rankings, I think, as you mentioned, the Detroit Pistons, again, are another team that I have my eye on, especially with J.D. Bickerstaff over there and his defensive mind. But I think there are some still true questions about what they'll be able to do, especially with losing one of their best three-point shooters in Malik Beasley, figuring out what Karis LeVert and Duncan Robinson's role is going to be. They're the number 10 seed in this ranking. They were 12th on this list before free agency. They're a very interesting team when it comes to how they're constructed and what they'll be able to do in the playoffs is probably the biggest question because they still don't have a whole lot of experience. Now that you add Duncan Robinson, been to the NBA Finals, will he play a similar role to Max Strus on the Detroit Pistons? Who knows? That is still to be seen. But I think unlike the Cavs, who are less so worried about the 82-game season and meshing and cohesion and all of these things, these teams that have added new pieces are stressing the importance of the 82-game season and how it can help them prepare for the playoffs and get things ready. We saw it for the regular season for the Cavs last year. Kenny Atkinson doing practices and adding a playoff scenario a day of practice for their guys to be prepared for when it happened in the playoffs. And I think that other coaches are using that strategy as well. And it's important to continue to keep an eye on what they'll be able to do successfully and what their weaknesses are during the regular season and how they can be exploited in the playoffs if the Cavs were to face them in a 7-game series.
I think the other thing, too, with Detroit really quick is that as we talk about with young teams, up-and-coming teams, the internal improvement, how much of a leap? That's always the question. How much of a leap can some of these guys make? Cade Cunningham went from what he was to all-star. Can he get into the MVP conversation? How much more of a leap is there from Cade that he can make? And then you talk about Asar Thompson. How much more of a leap can he make? An all-star level leap? Is it too early for an all-star level leap for him? Like when you talk about young teams, you always bank into this development, but there's no guarantee that just because a guy is young and talented, that it does happen that way. Not every young, talented player becomes an all-star. Not every young, talented player becomes a reliable starting quality player. I think there are questions about the kind of player that Jaden Ivey can be. Can he become an all-star? Probably not. If he can't become an all-star, what does that really mean for Detroit? Does Detroit need him to become an all-star? So these young teams, it's always interesting to me because there's this natural bank in, well, they're going to get better because they're younger. Well, maybe, but what if what they did last year, what if that's more representative of who they actually are? You know what I mean? They were a 44-win team last year. if Cade doesn't make that next leap, do they become a 50-win team? Is it possible for them to become a 50, or do they just stay as right around that 44-win mark? So I think it's always fascinating to watch a lot of these young teams, because with the Cavs, Evan Mobley made a leap. Darius Garland made a bounce back into all-star form, and that played a big part in them going from good team to great team in the regular season. If Jaden Ivey just stays static and doesn't take a step forward, if Astar Thompson just stays static and doesn't take enough of us, that's the thing. Like, how much of a leap is going to happen internally with some of these young guys that Detroit has identified as core component? Ron Allen, same kind of thing. Those are core players for Detroit, and what they did last year, really, really good starting point. But how much more can they take off from there? It's hard to quantify that. It's hard to predict that. But it probably will be the difference between whether they're a real threat in italics and just like a looming threat by Eastern Conference standards.
Chris, we talked at the beginning of the podcast about the Denver Nuggets, one of the teams that made some of the best moves this offseason. I think it's only right that we end the podcast with probably the second best acquisitions and moves of the summer, the Houston Rockets. They're listed number 6 on this list. They were listed 9th at the previous ranking. They re-signed Fred VanVleet. They re-signed Aaron Holiday. They re-signed Steven Adams. They re-signed Jeff Green. They acquired Dorian Finney-Smith, Clint Capella, Kevin Durant, and they lost Dylan Brooks, Cam Whitmore, Jalen Green, Nate Williams, and Jock Landale. I mean, I think you take a massive step forward with the moves that you make. Again, you mentioned Asar Thompson for the Detroit Pistons. Amen Thompson, some people argue to say that he's better than his brother. Some people argue to say that he's one of the most athletic players that have touched the NBA. So I think you see his growth. You already saw him take a minor step forward last year. You now get to see him take another step forward this coming season. Also training with Kevin Durant on a daily basis for a kid like that who is trying to improve his shot, trying to improve his work, all of these things. I think that's going to help him dramatically. Plus, we talked about this at the beginning of the year, beginning of the summer. Steven Adams getting re-signed with the Houston Rockets is huge for them and Alfred Sengun, and how that dynamic is going to help them in the playoffs and just the physicality and the brute strength that Steven Adams has. This is a team that I could see in the top 4 when it comes to the power rankings by the end of the season, by trade deadline time, all of these things. Because this is a team that has been constructed to win now with the understanding that Kevin Durant is not getting any younger. And he believes that this is a situation where he can win another championship. So I think when we talk about contenders, when we talk about sleepers, when we talk about teams that can go up against the OKC Thunder, I think the Houston Rockets have the athleticism, the tenacity, the physicality, the strength, all of the intangibles required to face up against a team like the OKC Thunder, maybe even the Denver Nuggets, which is funny to think about it this way and saying that the Denver Nuggets are the team that teams don't want to face. But it's true. Yep. Denver is this juggernaut, and especially bringing the band back together, the Western Conference is going to be a dogfight. It always is, but this coming season might be to a different level when it comes to the top 4 teams in that conference.
Count me as a Houston believer. The only bad thing that I'll say about Houston is that they're in the West and not the East. So that just makes the road to get where they ultimately want to get to and take that next step as an organization. It's tougher to do that in the West than it is in the East. So I'll definitely be keeping my eye on that. But having somebody that they can go to in late game situations instead of what their offense often resulted in late game situations in the playoffs, having somebody to do that with who is KD, who is one of the best scorers in NBA history, who is a proven playoff performer, that's going to fix a lot of the things that happened to Houston that prevented them from becoming the team that they wanted to be in the playoffs last year. So I am definitely a Houston believer.
All right. With all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.